You think every grandma made the same Christmas recipes, right? From 1920 to 2025, every single generation had completely different favorite Christmas recipes.
It'll be a surprise if you have any left, but if you do, good for lamb. Leftover lamb stew is good reheated or as a new dish in disguise.
Some made candy that took 3 days. Some made cookies from countries they came from. Some made desserts with ingredients we don't use anymore. What they chose to make reveals who they were. Their Christmas recipe is their story. 30 forgotten Christmas recipes from our grandparents. Each one tells you something about that generation and the America they lived in. Fried chicken with biscuits, backyard chicken soaked in buttermilk overnight, dredged in flour, seasoned with salt, pepper, paprika, fried in lard in cast-iron skillet until golden and crispy. Biscuits made from scratch, flour, buttermilk, butter, salt, rolled and cut with glass, baked until golden. The chicken was tougher than modern poultry, requiring buttermilk to tenderize. The biscuits absorbed the gravy and drippings. This meal cost almost nothing but created festive Christmas dinner, served hot with butter and gravy on the side. The golden skin crackled when you bit into it. The meat was tender, despite being from an older bird. This represented resourcefulness, raising your own chickens, using what you had, creating celebration from basics. The meal appeared on Christmas Eve tables across the South and Midwest, made entirely from home-raised or homegrown ingredients. No store-bought components, complete self-sufficiency in one meal. Cornbread baked from scratch in cast iron with bacon fat, cornmeal, buttermilk, eggs, sugar, crumbled and mixed with sautéed onions, celery, rich broth from chicken or beef bones, baked alongside the main meat until golden crust formed. The cornbread sweetness balanced the savory broth and vegetables, each element cooked separately, then combined. The texture was moist, but held its shape. Prepared the day of Christmas Eve dinner, made in large quantities to fill multiple pans, stuffed large turkeys or served on the side. Every bite had cornbread pieces, vegetables, broth. The flavor developed through long baking. The top edges crisped while the interior stayed moist. This was not Thanksgiving dressing. It was Southern Christmas tradition, served at every Christmas Eve meal, represented the use of cornbread in multiple ways. One ingredient transformed through different preparations into the foundation of holiday meals. Oysters purchased fresh from local sources or fishermen, kept cold in shells until cooking time. Cream or milk heated with butter, salt, pepper, sometimes paprika. Fresh oysters added with their liquid, cooked just until edges curled, seconds only. Overcooking made them tough. The stew was finished at the last moment before serving. Delicate flavor from oysters mixed with richness of cream. Served in bowls, usually as first course or light supper. Represented regional tradition in coastal communities. Oysters were affordable then, making this luxury meal possible. Fresh oysters provided brininess and unique flavor. The cream created luxurious texture without overwhelming delicate oyster taste. This meal required access to fresh oysters, making it specific to certain regions. Appeared on Christmas Eve tables in coastal areas and port cities. Represented sophistication and regional specialty simultaneously. Collard greens grown in garden, harvested after first frost, which improved their sweetness, washed thoroughly to remove grit, chopped, cooked low and slow in pot with bacon fat, onions, sometimes ham hock, simmered for hours, becoming tender and deeply flavored. The long cooking time allowed flavors to develop. Greens broke down into soft texture. Broth became rich and savory. Served with fresh cornbread made from scratch, cornmeal, buttermilk, eggs, sugar baked in cast iron. The cornbread absorbed the greens' pot liquor. Simple preparation, complex flavors developed through time. This was foundation of Southern eating. Greens represented garden crops that produced through winter. The combination of greens and cornbread was complete meal. Served at every Christmas Eve. No elaborate preparation, just patience. The long cooking transformed simple ingredients into something deep and satisfying. Dried pinto beans from garden harvest, stored in pantry for months. Soaked overnight or quick-boiled, then rested. Cooked low and slow for hours with onions, garlic, bacon, or salt pork. The beans broke down into creamy mixture, absorbing all flavors. The cooking required little active work, just occasional stirring. The result was deeply satisfying, warm, filling food, costing almost nothing. Beans represented budget cooking, reliable protein, filling side dish, served in bowls, sometimes with cornbread crumbled on top, sometimes with fried egg alongside. The bacon fat flavored the entire pot. The natural starch from beans created creamy texture without dairy. This meal repeated throughout winter, made in large batches, eaten multiple times. Christmas version was same process, but served with more ceremonial attention. The beans were foundation of Southern cooking during hard times. Biscuits made late on Christmas Eve from flour, salt, butter, buttermilk. Mixed quickly, rolled out, cut with glass, baked until golden and puffed. Simultaneously, sausage browned, flour sprinkled over it, stirred to paste, milk or cream slowly added while stirring to prevent lumps. Gravy thickened into creamy mixture studded with sausage pieces. Biscuits removed from oven steaming hot, split open, gravy poured over them. Comforting dish meant kitchen was still full of activity at midnight on Christmas Eve. This was late-night snack, way to stretch celebration. Simple ingredients transformed into something satisfying. No complicated technique, just basic understanding of how to make biscuits and gravy. This meal repeated throughout Southern winters. Christmas version was served with special attention and ceremony. Represented kitchen culture when midnight snacks were normal and expected. Chicken necks or similar parts boiled until meat fell from bones, creating both broth and meat. The broth became base for dumplings. Southern-style dumplings made from flour, salt, water, or buttermilk, rolled thin, cut into strips. Dumplings dropped into simmering broth, cooked until set but tender. They absorbed the rich broth while cooking. Result was more about experience than expense. Warm, filling, satisfying. The dumplings had delicate texture. The broth carried flavor from bones and meat. After butchering pigs, rendered fat left behind cracklings, crispy bits. These golden treasures were saved, stored in jars. For Christmas Eve, cornbread, cracklings worked into batter, along with cornmeal, flour, buttermilk, eggs, salt, sugar, baked in hot cast-iron skillet with bacon fat until golden brown. Cracklings stayed crispy inside cornbread, providing textural contrast and porky flavor. The cornbread represented complete use of animal, nothing wasted, every part valued. If family had ham for Christmas, bone was simmered in water with whatever vegetables available. Carrots, celery, onions, sometimes dried beans, soaked first. The ham bone released gelatin and flavor into broth, creating something rich and deeply satisfying. Vegetables softened, absorbed salty, meaty flavor. Sometimes dumplings added to soup. Sometimes cornbread crumbles stirred in. Sometimes served plain with vegetables in rich broth. The soup simmered for hours, filling kitchen with aroma, stayed warm on back of stove, available for anyone who got hungry. In rural hunting communities, grandfather or uncle brought home squirrel from woods. The meat was tough, requiring long cooking to become tender. Cut into pieces, seasoned with salt and pepper, browned in fat in heavy pot. Vegetables added, carrots, celery, onions, potatoes from storage. Broth added, pot covered, simmered for hours until meat fell apart. Vegetables absorbed all flavors. The stew was earthy, rich, completely different from chicken or pork. The flavor was wild, gamey, complex. This represented connection between hunting, food, survival. Game meat on Christmas Eve table meant someone had gone to woods with rifle, had been successful, brought home food for family. In river communities, fresh catfish purchased from fishermen or family member who fished. The fish was cleaned, skin removed, tough, organs removed. Whole cleaned fish dredged in cornmeal, seasoned with salt and pepper. Fried in hot fat until golden and crispy outside, tender and flaky inside, served whole, head intact, tail visible. This was dramatic presentation. It meant someone had caught it fresh. Someone knew how to prepare it. Represented regional tradition tied to specific landscapes. Rivers provided food if you knew how to harvest and prepare. When commercial catfish farming started, farmed fish tasted completely different from wild. They were less flavorful, less interesting. If family raised pigs, Christmas Eve featured fresh pork. Thick chops cut from loin, seasoned with salt and pepper, browned in cast-iron skillet in lard or bacon fat. Once browned, heat reduced, chops finished cooking slowly, meat becoming tender and juicy. Simultaneously, applesauce made from apples stored in cellar, cored, chopped, cooked down with bit of sugar until they broke down into thick sauce. Sometimes cinnamon added if available. Applesauce served alongside pork chops, tartness cutting through richness of pork. This combination represented seasonal understanding of food, pork available certain seasons, apples stored in cellars. Whole chicken simmered for hours, creating rich gelatinous stock. Chicken removed, meat picked from bones, meat returned to broth. Dumplings dropped in, simple dough of flour, water, salt, sometimes lard. Dumplings cooked in simmering broth, absorbing flavor, becoming tender but distinct. Result was bowl of soup, mostly broth with chunks of tender chicken and dumplings floating. The dumplings had delicate texture. The broth was rich from hours of cooking. The chicken provided substance and flavor. This was ultimate comfort food. Meant kitchen was warm and full of people. Represented complete use of ingredients. Every part of chicken used, every bit of flavor extracted, nothing wasted. Grandmother grew okra and tomatoes in garden. In late summer and early fall, she preserved them. Canned tomatoes, sometimes dried okra. For Christmas Eve, combined in pot with onions, garlic if available, sometimes pork fat or bacon. Simmered until okra tender and tomatoes broken down into sauce. Flavor was complex, bright from tomatoes, earthy from okra, rich from protein. This represented southern garden and seasonal cycle of eating what you grew and preserving for winter. The okra thickened the stew naturally through its own starch. If family had means to raise cattle or had trade providing beef, Christmas Eve featured deep, rich stew. Tough cut of beef, kind requiring long, slow cooking. Browned in lard in cast-iron pot, then onions, carrots, potatoes, celery added from storage or garden. Broth added, everything simmered for hours until meat fell apart. Vegetables absorbed all flavors. Stew thickened as it cooked, becoming almost gravy, deeply savory and satisfying. Beef stew represented abundance, ability to have beef on Christmas Eve table. It represented long, slow cooking as method of creating tenderness and flavor. When family butchered, fresh liver available, beef, pork, or chicken. Organ meat was free. For Christmas Eve, liver sliced thin, lightly dredged in flour, seared quickly in hot skillet in lard or bacon fat. cooked just until outside brown and inside still pink, keeping liver tender. Simultaneously, onions cooked slowly in another skillet until golden and sweet. Liver served with onions piled on top. Combination was rich, deeply savory. Onions provided sweetness-balancing mineral richness of liver. This represented complete use of animal, no waste. In coastal areas with access to salt fish, dried or salt-preserved mackerel or herring stored for winter use. Before cooking, soaked to reduce salt, then laid in baking dish with butter, lemon if available, herbs, baked until cooked through, skin crispy, flesh tender and flaky. Flavor was intensely fishy, salty, deeply satisfying. This represented regional traditions tied to specific communities and specific ways of preserving food. Saltfish was reliable winter protein that stored for years without refrigeration. When refrigeration became standard, and fresh fish became available year-round through commercial fishing, saltfish stopped being necessary. Knowledge of how to cook with saltfish, how to properly soak it, how to judge doneness, disappeared. Today, saltfish barely known except in communities maintaining strong cultural traditions tied to fishing or immigration history. In sophisticated Southern households or European immigrant households, chicken livers cooked, pureed with butter and seasonings, spread on bread or crackers as elegant appetizer. Livers simmered gently in butter with onions, garlic, herbs, then pushed through sieve or pounded into smooth paste with butter. Result was spread that was rich, deeply savory, elegant, represented understanding that simple ingredients could be transformed into something sophisticated through technique and time. Chicken liver mousse represented full spectrum of Southern cooking, from rustic to refined. When attitudes toward organ meat shifted, and when time in kitchen became less valued, chicken liver mousse disappeared from sophisticated tables. Knowledge of how to prepare it, how to achieve right texture, how to season properly, disappeared. Today, chicken liver mousse, almost extinct in American cooking. Grandmother made sausage from pork she raised and butchered, grinding meat, mixing with salt, pepper, seasonings like sage and thyme, stuffing into casings, saved or using loose. Christmas Eve, sausage browned, rice and broth added, everything cooked together until rice tender and absorbed all sausage flavor. Sometimes vegetables added, onions, celery, peppers if available. Result was complete dish, protein, starch, vegetables all in one pot. Sausage and rice pilaf represented resourceful one-pot cooking, understanding that ingredients combined created something greater than individual parts, represented knowledge of how to make sausage, how to cook rice properly, how to balance flavors. When sausage became something bought ready-made and rice became available pre-cooked, knowledge disappeared. Confection making at most demanding. Cook sugar, corn syrup, water to exactly 260 degrees Fahrenheit hardball stage, temperature critical, requiring judgment without thermometer. Beat egg whites until stiff peaks formed. Hot syrup poured into beaten whites while continuing to beat, mixture turning white and fluffy as air incorporated. Pecans folded in carefully, spoonfuls dropped onto waxed paper where they set into pieces crispy on outside, chewy inside. Flavor intensely sweet but clean, pecans providing contrast. Divinity represented understanding of sugar chemistry, knowledge of temperature and timing, patience required for candy making, represented knowledge passed down through families, instructions given by demonstration rather than written recipes. Process was unforgiving. Missed temperature by 5 degrees and candy became grainy instead of smooth. Beat egg whites too little, and they wouldn't incorporate syrup properly. Beat too long, and they'd lose body and collapse. Time combination wrong, and mixture set before spoonfuls could be dropped. Grandmother understood these things intuitively, could feel when sugar at right temperature by testing in cold water. When candy became something bought from stores, home candy making declined. Young people grew up not understanding complexity of candy making, critical temperatures, exact beating times. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today, Divinity almost extinct, except in most traditional Southern households. Louisiana's contribution to Christmas candy making. Cook brown sugar, butter, cream to exactly 236 degrees Fahrenheit softball stage. Beat in pecans, working quickly before mixture set. Spoonfuls dropped onto waxed paper, creating clusters of caramelized sugar studded with pecans. Texture supposed to be creamy, barely set, melting on tongue. Flavor rich, buttery, intensely sweet. Pecan pralines represented regional candy traditions tied to specific places and specific knowledge, understanding that timing was critical, that you had seconds to work before candy set completely. Too early, and it wouldn't set at all. Too late, and it became grainy and hard. Process required understanding of how brown sugar behaved differently from white sugar. Brown sugar contained molasses, affecting both cooking temperature and texture of final candy. Cream had to be right fat content. Heavy cream worked differently than light cream. Butter had to be good quality. Pecans had to be fresh and of good quality. Grandmother knew all this intuitively through experience. Today, pralines sold commercially. Commercial versions harder, less flavorful, more uniform. Both food and entertainment. Cook molasses, sugar, butter, vinegar to exactly right temperature. Pour onto buttered marble or buttered baking sheet to cool. When cool enough to handle but still warm, invite people to help pull. Everyone butter hands heavily and start pulling taffy, stretching out and folding back on itself repeatedly, 15 to 20 minutes. Candy gradually lightened from dark brown to golden as air incorporated through pulling process. Temperature changed as candy cooled. Moment of proper pulling consistency, critical. Too warm and sticky would burn hands. Too cool and impossible to pull would break instead of stretching. Taffy pulling represented community and shared work, combining candy making with entertainment. Families gathered around kitchen as someone pulled taffy. Children watched and learned by demonstration. Work was hard, but result was worth it. Taffy twisted and cut, pieces wrapped in waxed paper that had been colored with food coloring or plain. When commercial candy replaced homemade, and when entertaining shifted away from kitchen activities, taffy pulling disappeared. Shell peanuts if raw, or use roasted peanuts if available. Cook sugar, butter, corn syrup to hard crack stage. Exactly 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature critical, line between perfect and burnt, measured in seconds. At right moment, stir in peanuts and butter. Mixture foamed up dramatically from baking soda, creating chemical reaction that made brittle light and porous. Pour onto buttered baking sheet. Spread thin with metal spatula before set. Once set, break into irregular shards. Flavor intensely sweet, caramelized, with crunchy peanuts throughout. Peanut brittle represented understanding of candy chemistry, critical temperatures, exact timing required. Represented knowledge of how sugar behaves at different temperatures, how right additions could change texture. Grandmother understood through years of practice and experimentation, could watch sugar cooking and know by color when approaching right temperature, could listen to sound of cooking sugar, could judge exact moment to add baking soda by instinct. While basic molasses taffy most common, grandmother might make variations. Saltwater taffy with added salt, creating distinctive flavor. Chocolate taffy with cocoa powder mixed into mixture. Molasses-free taffy using just sugar and butter for lighter confection. Each variation required slightly different temperatures, slightly different beating times, different amounts of pulling time. Each created specific texture and flavor profile. Saltwater taffy tasted salty sweet, flavor refreshing and complex. Chocolate taffy, rich and dark, cocoa powder creating different chemical reaction. Light taffy without molasses, less complex, but more delicate. Knowledge was in understanding how different ingredients affected final product, how small changes created different results. Represented experimental knowledge passed down through families, instructions given by watching and doing rather than following written recipes. Grandmother might try new flavor and adjust based on results. She might say, "That needs more salt," or "That's too dark," based on intuition and experience. Cream butter and sugar together, add molasses and spices, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, then stir in flour. Drop spoonfuls onto baking sheets and bake until crackled on top, still soft in middle. Some rolled in sugar before baking, creating sparkly coating on outside. Flavor deeply spiced, richly molasses forward, texture soft and chewy. Molasses cookies represented both knowledge of baking, understanding how ingredients interacted, how to achieve proper texture, and connection to ingredients like molasses that were common and affordable. Molasses was byproduct of sugar refining, making it inexpensive, added depth and complexity to baked goods. Cookies stayed soft for days if stored properly. Grandmother kept them in tin with bread, which helped keep them moist. Bread dried out slightly while cookies stayed soft. Perfect exchange. Making molasses cookies required understanding several chemical and physical processes. How creaming butter and sugar incorporated air into dough, how molasses affected dough consistency and texture, how spices added flavor and also acted as slight leavening agents. Grandmother understood through experience how things worked together, could feel when butter and sugar properly creamed, could judge how much flour to add without making notes, knew by feel and experience when dough was right, when commercial cookie baking declined, and when homemade cookies seemed too time-consuming, molasses cookies disappeared. Southern variations on shortbread using cornmeal instead of or alongside regular flour. Cream, butter, and sugar, then mix in flour and cornmeal, sometimes adding touch of vanilla or other flavoring. Either roll dough thin and cut into shapes, or drop by spoonfuls and flatten slightly. Bake until pale golden, staying tender and crispy at edges. Flavor distinct, not quite sweet. Cornmeal providing subtle grittiness most people loved. Cornmeal provided texture and slightly corn-forward flavor that was comforting and familiar. Also made cookies crumbly in way that was pleasant and unique. Cornmeal cookies represented regional variations on basics, showed that you could substitute ingredients, create variations, make things your own, while keeping basic structure same. Process of making cornmeal cookies required understanding of how cornmeal affected dough differently than all-purpose flour. Cornmeal absorbed less moisture, created different texture, required adjusting amount of liquid in recipe. Baking time might be different. Cookies might spread differently or bake at different rates. Grandmother understood through experience what adjustments were needed, knew intuitively how much to adjust when she used cornmeal, could feel dough and know if it was right, could watch cookies baking and know when they were done. When commercial cookies dominated and when home baking declined, cornmeal cookies disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding that you could make variations on basic recipes, not understanding how different flour types affected texture, not understanding creative possibilities. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today, cornmeal cookies rarely seen even in South. The understanding that you could experiment with flour types, that variations created new things. Spiced cake made from molasses and multiple spices. Sheet cake cut into squares, not cut into shapes. Mix molasses, butter, sugar, spices, ginger, cinnamon, cloves with flour sometimes vinegar. Bake in sheet pan until spiced and warm. Fills house with distinctive gingerbread aroma. Flavor deeply spiced, warming, kind of thing that meant Christmas was truly arriving. Gingerbread represented knowledge of how spices work together, how molasses adds depth, how baking creates chemical transformation that changes everything. The spices were essential. Ginger provided sharpness, cinnamon provided warmth, cloves provided depth. The combination was not random, but carefully considered. The proportions mattered. Too much ginger and gingerbread became too sharp. Too much cinnamon and it became overwhelming. The cloves had to be in right proportion or they would take over. Grandmother knew by taste, by smell, by experience, what proportions were right. She could smell when the spices were right. She could taste a bit of batter and know if the balance was correct. When commercial gingerbread mixes became available, home baking declined. Young people grew up not understanding how to combine spices, not understanding how to achieve proper texture, not understanding how to judge baking time. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today's gingerbread, when made at all, often uses convenience mixes and tastes thin compared to grandmother's version. The understanding of how spices work together, how molasses created depth, how the interaction of ingredients created complexity, that understanding is almost completely lost from American baking. Smooth chocolate candy made by cooking sugar to soft ball stage, then beating with wooden spoon until thick. Cook sugar, butter, milk to 238 degrees Fahrenheit soft ball stage, testing by dropping bit into cold water. Remove from heat. Add vanilla. Beat with wooden spoon until it loses gloss and thickens, usually about 10 minutes arm-burning work. Pour into buttered pan. Let set. Cut into perfect squares. First bite was pure chocolate luxury. Creamy, intense, not too sweet, with faint graininess that meant real homemade fudge, not smooth store-bought imposter. Fudge represented most demanding candy-making skill. Understanding sugar at different temperatures, understanding how beating affected texture, understanding chemistry of crystallization. Too much beating and fudge became too grainy. Not enough beating, and it stayed too soft. The timing was critical. Grandmother understood through years of practice when fudge was done beating. She could feel the consistency changing in the wooden spoon. She could tell by how it looked when it reached right stage. When candy became something bought, and when fudge recipes requiring exact temperatures became norm, traditional method nearly disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding how to judge temperature by feel, not understanding critical beating times, not understanding that under-seasoning made fudge grainy. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today's fudge, when made at all, usually follows recipes and uses thermometers, losing intuitive knowledge that grandmother had. The understanding that you could know through experience when things were right, that equipment wasn't necessary, that your senses and knowledge were enough. That understanding is almost completely gone from American households. Modern fudge lacks the complexity and satisfaction of grandmother's version. Layers of dark and white chocolate topped with crushed candy canes. Melt dark chocolate. Spread thin on parchment-lined baking sheet. Let it set completely. Melt white chocolate. Add few drops of peppermint extract. Spread over dark chocolate layer. Immediately sprinkle crushed candy canes over top, pressing gently into white chocolate. Let set completely. Then break into irregular pieces. Combination of dark chocolate's bitterness, white chocolate's sweetness, and peppermint's brightness created complex flavor. Peppermint bark represented understanding of chocolate, know-how of working with chocolate properly, knowledge of how flavors interacted. Dark chocolate provided bitter depth that balanced white chocolate's sweetness. Peppermint provided brightness that cut through richness. The three flavors together created something greater than individual parts. When chocolate became something melted from prepared products, and when candy making declined, peppermint bark disappeared from homemaking. Young people grew up not understanding that you could make peppermint bark from scratch, not understanding how chocolate behaved, not understanding balance of flavors. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today, Peppermint bark widely available commercially, but homemade versions rare. The understanding of how to work with chocolate, how to layer it properly, how to create complex flavor combinations, that knowledge is almost completely gone from mainstream American households. Modern peppermint bark is convenient, but lacks depth and nuance of homemade version. The satisfaction of making it yourself, the knowledge of how things work together, the pride in creating something beautiful and delicious, that experience is largely gone. The understanding that you could make this treat at home using quality ingredients has been replaced with buying pre-made versions. Butter and cream candy cooked to firm ball stage, 248 degrees Fahrenheit. Cook sugar, corn syrup, butter, heavy cream in heavy saucepan, stirring constantly to prevent scorching until reaching 248 degrees firm ball stage. Stirring was critical. Stop even minute and you had burnt caramel. Add vanilla at end. Pour into buttered pan. Let set overnight. Cut into squares with buttered knife. Wrap each piece individually in waxed paper. Texture was achievement. Soft enough to yield to teeth, but firm enough to hold shape. Creamy throughout, dissolving slowly with intense butter and vanilla flavor. They were candy that proved someone spent real time and effort on you, making them precious gifts. Caramels represented most refined candy-making knowledge. Understanding subtle temperature differences, understanding exactly how they affected final texture, understanding chemistry that made candy possible. Your grandmother understood through years of practice when caramels reached right temperature, could feel the difference between 246 and 248 degrees through observation and experience, knew exactly when to stop cooking. When candy became something bought, and when home candy making became seen as too difficult, caramel making largely disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding critical temperatures, not understanding how quickly texture changed with temperature variation, not understanding wrapping and storage. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today's commercial caramels taste nothing like grandmother made. Modern versions often too hard, too candied, lacking creamy texture that made real caramels special. While peanut brittle, most common, and sesame brittle might occasionally appear, your grandmother might have experimented with brittle using sesame seeds instead of peanuts. The sesame created deeper flavor, slightly less brightness, richer character. Process was same, cooking to hard crack stage, adding nuts and baking soda, pouring onto buttered sheets, but flavor distinctly different. Sesame brittle tasted nutty and toasted, different from peanut brittle in fundamental ways. The sesame seeds provided different texture, smaller, crisper, distributed differently through the candy. This represented understanding how ingredient choices affected flavor profiles, how changing one component created entirely different dish, how same basic process with different ingredients created variations. Your grandmother understood this through experimentation and tasting. She might try sesame brittle and say, "That's good," or adjust proportions next time. She created variations through trial and adjustment. When candy became something bought and when home candy making became seen as too complicated, sesame brittle disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding that brittle came in varieties, not understanding that sesame could be used instead of peanuts, not understanding that you could experiment within framework. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today, most people never heard of sesame brittle or almond brittle or walnut brittle. They think brittle comes in one version only, or they don't make it at all. The understanding that you could make variations by changing ingredients, that basic process allowed flexibility. That understanding is almost completely gone. The loss represents loss of confidence in cooking, loss of understanding that experimentation within parameters was how things developed, loss of knowledge that variations created interest and complexity. Most modern candy making has become standardized and inflexible. Brown sugar fudge made by cooking brown sugar, butter, milk to softball stage, 238 degrees Fahrenheit. Beat until thick and loses gloss. Pour into buttered pan, cut into squares. Process same as white fudge, but brown sugar created different results from white sugar. Brown sugar contained molasses, affecting both cooking and texture. The fudge had different color, deeper, more golden, different flavor, caramel-like rather than just sweet. This represented understanding that brown sugar and white sugar were different ingredients, not interchangeable. That ingredient choice mattered fundamentally, that you could create variations by understanding how ingredients worked differently. Your grandmother knew this. When she made panouche, she used brown sugar deliberately, understanding what results it would create. She knew that panouche tasted different from chocolate fudge. She knew it was special. When fudge recipes became standardized and when commercial candy dominated, panouche largely disappeared. Young people grew up thinking fudge meant chocolate fudge. They didn't understand that you could make variations using different sugars. They didn't know panouche existed. Knowledge largely disappeared. While basic Divinity made with pecans most common, your grandmother might make variations with walnuts, almonds, or no nuts at all. She might color it pink or green with food coloring. Each variation required understanding that basic method stayed same, cooking sugar to hard ball stage, beating into egg whites, but additions created different experiences, represented knowledge that candy making followed principles but allowed creativity within those principles. Divinity with walnuts tasted different from Divinity with pecans. Walnuts, less sweet, more earthy. Divinity with no nuts was pure candy, all sweetness and texture. Your grandmother understood through experience how different nuts affected flavor, how food coloring didn't change taste but changed appearance, how you could play with variations while keeping basic structure. When candy became something bought, and when home candy making declined, variations disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding that Divinity came in varieties, not understanding that you could experiment within framework. Most modern candy making has become standardized. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today, most people never heard of Divinity variations. They think candy comes in one version or they buy it from stores. The understanding that you could make variations, that basic recipe allowed flexibility, that experimentation created interest, that understanding is almost completely gone. Candy-making science. Your grandmother makes supersaturated sugar solution by cooking sugar in water, then carefully pour it into jars where it would crystallize over days. Sometimes she'd add food coloring or flavoring. Children watched crystals form, learned about crystallization and chemistry through candy. Result was beautiful, tasty, magical. Sugar transforming from liquid to crystal. Rock candy represented understanding that candy making was science, that patience and understanding of chemistry could create beauty. Represented teaching children about how things worked through hands-on experience. The process was slow. Days would pass before significant crystals formed, but the result was worth waiting for. Beautiful clear crystals that looked like jewels that you could eat, that represented successful science experiment. Your grandmother understood crystallization. She knew that sugar solution had to be right concentration. She knew that disturbance would cause premature crystallization. She knew timing mattered. While basic pulled taffy most common, your grandmother might make variations, hard-pulled candies that became translucent and tooth-breakingly hard, soft-pulled candies that stayed chewy. Each required understanding how temperature affected final texture, how beating changed candy, how storage conditions mattered. Pulled sugar candy represented highest level of candy-making knowledge, understanding sugar behavior at multiple temperatures, understanding how technique created texture, understanding chemistry of crystallization and cooking. Hard-pulled candies required cooking to higher temperatures than soft taffy. They became translucent and brilliant when light shone through them. They looked like jewels. They were beautiful, but could crack teeth if you weren't careful. Soft pulled candies required lower temperatures and different amounts of beating. They stayed chewy rather than hard. They were easier to eat, but less dramatic visually. Your grandmother understood how to judge which process to use based on what she wanted to create. She knew through experience what results different temperatures would create. When candy became something bought, and when home candy making declined, these variations largely disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding that you could create different textures by changing temperatures, not understanding that technique mattered fundamentally, not understanding that candy making involved choices. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today's commercial pulled candies bear little resemblance to what grandmother made. They're standardized for shelf life, not for flavor or texture. The loss represents loss of understanding that cooking involved decisions, that knowing how different techniques created different results was essential knowledge. That mastery came through understanding principles rather than following recipes. The knowledge that grandmother possessed, confidence to experiment, to adjust, to create variations, that knowledge is almost completely gone from mainstream American cooking. While Louisiana pecan praline's most famous, your grandmother might make variations with different nuts or different sugars. She might make brown sugar pralines or white sugar pralines, each creating different flavor profiles. Each required same understanding of temperature and timing, but produced distinctly different results. Brown sugar pralines tasted like caramel. White sugar pralines were different, more purely sweet. The texture varied too. Brown sugar pralines tended to be slightly softer. White sugar pralines could be creamier or grainier, depending on technique. This represented knowledge that you could create variations while understanding core principles. It represented understanding that ingredient choices fundamentally changed what you created. Your grandmother knew through experience what results different sugars would create. She deliberately chose brown sugar or white sugar based on what she wanted the final candy to taste like. She understood how this choice affected everything. When praline making declined and when commercial candy dominated, these variations disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding that pralines came in varieties, not understanding that different ingredients created different results. Brittle that was then dipped partially or fully into chocolate. Your grandmother would make brittle using her standard method, then once set, she'd melt chocolate and dip pieces into it or spread chocolate over a sheet of brittle. Combination of crunchy brittle with smooth chocolate created textural and flavor complexity. It represented understanding that you could combine candy techniques to create new variation, that separate techniques, brittle making and chocolate dipping, could be combined to create something new. The brittleness of the candy contrasted with smoothness of chocolate, the hard crunch of sugar followed by creamy chocolate. The flavor combination was interesting. Sweetness of brittle, different from chocolate's slight bitterness. Your grandmother understood through experience how to combine these techniques, what worked, what didn't. She could adjust thickness of chocolate coating, timing of dipping, temperature. Everything had to be at. When candy making declined and when commercial products dominated, these combinations largely disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding that you could combine different candy making techniques. Molasses brittle. While sugar brittle most common, your grandmother might make brittle using molasses instead of sugar or combination of both. Molasses created deeper flavor, slightly less brightness, richer character. Process same, cooking to hard crack stage, adding nuts and baking soda, pouring onto buttered sheets. But flavor distinctly different. Molasses brittle tasted earthier. The molasses provided depth that sugar alone couldn't create. The caramel notes from molasses gave the brittle complexity. This represented understanding how ingredient choices affected flavor fundamentally, how changing one component created entirely different dish, how same basic process with different ingredients created variation. Your grandmother understood this through experimentation and tasting. She might try molasses brittle and adjust proportions next time. Your grandmother would make smooth fondant paste from powdered sugar, butter, and milk or cream, then flavor it with vanilla, peppermint, or other flavoring. She'd form it into balls or logs, sometimes dipping them in chocolate, sometimes leaving them plain. Texture was smooth, creamy, melting on tongue. Fondant candies represented most refined candy-making technique, understanding how to create smooth emulsions, how to work with fondant paste, how to flavor delicately. The process required beating fondant until it reached right consistency. Too much beating and it became grainy. Not enough beating and it stayed too soft. The timing was critical. Your grandmother understood through years of practice when fondant was beaten enough. She could feel the consistency changing. She could tell by how it looked when it was right, when candy became something bought, and when home candy making became seen as too difficult. Fondant candies largely disappeared from home kitchens. Young people grew up not understanding process, not understanding that you could create smooth candies through home methods, not understanding specific technique requirements. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today, fondant candies mainly produced commercially. When they're made at home, it's usually from commercial fondant rather than made from scratch. The loss represents loss of understanding that candy making was skill, that practice and knowledge were required, that achieving smooth texture required understanding how ingredients worked together. Modern fondant making has become too dependent on commercial products, too standardized, too limited in creative possibility. The knowledge that grandmother possessed, that understanding of how to beat fondant to right consistency, crystallized fruits. Your grandmother would cook fruit pieces in sugar syrup repeatedly over days, each cooking reducing moisture and allowing more sugar to penetrate. Eventually, she'd coat them in granulated sugar and let them dry. Result was jewel-like candies that tasted intensely of fruit, but were preserved and lasted weeks or months. Crystallized fruits represented patience, understanding of sugar's preserving properties, knowledge of how to create texture through repeated cooking. It represented understanding that candy making could preserve and transform simultaneously. The process was slow. Days would pass before fruit was fully crystallized, but result was worth waiting for. The fruit remained recognizable, but was preserved by sugar. It tasted intensely fruity, but was also candy, sweet and indulgent. Your grandmother understood preservation through sugar. She knew that repeated cooking allowed sugar to penetrate deeply. She knew that final coating in sugar helped preserve the fruit further. When candy became something bought, and when home preservation declined, crystallized fruits largely disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding that you could preserve fruit through sugar, not understanding repeated cooking process, not understanding how result worked both as candy and as preserved fruit. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today, crystallized fruits, mainly produced commercially. When they appear, they're often expensive luxury items rather than homemade candy. The loss represents loss of understanding that candy making was food preservation, that multiple techniques could be combined, that patience created results that couldn't be rushed. Modern candy making has become too quick, too dependent on commercial products, too limited in scope. The knowledge that grandmother possessed, that understanding of how to preserve through repeated cooking, how to create complex texture through time, how patience created unique results, that knowledge is almost completely gone from American households. Most people today would never think to crystallize fruit. The possibility doesn't exist in their understanding. Pulled saltwater taffy. While basic molasses taffy most common, your grandmother might make saltwater taffy using just sugar and butter without molasses, sometimes adding touch of salt. Lighter color and slightly different flavor represented understanding how ingredient choices affected final product. Pulling process, same, but created different results. Saltwater taffy tasted different from molasses taffy, less depth, less complexity, but different kind of sweetness. The salt added brightness that cut through sweetness without making candy taste salty. This represented variation within known framework, experimentation within understood parameters. It represented understanding that same basic process with different ingredients created new things. Your grandmother understood through experimentation and tasting. She might make saltwater taffy and compare it to molasses taffy. She would adjust proportions based on what she was trying to achieve. When candy making declined and when commercial candy dominated, variations disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding that you could make taffy without molasses, not understanding that variations existed, not understanding that experimenting was how things developed. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today's commercial saltwater taffy bears little resemblance to what grandmother made. Modern versions are standardized and mass-produced. The loss represents loss of confidence in candy making, loss of understanding that you could experiment within frameworks, loss of knowledge that variations created interest and complexity. Modern candy making has become too dependent on recipes, too standardized, too limited in creative possibility. The knowledge that grandmother possessed, that confidence to try variations, to adjust proportions, to create something slightly different from basic recipe, that knowledge is almost completely gone from American households. Most people today would never think to make taffy without molasses. The possibility doesn't exist in their understanding of what's possible in candy making. In some communities, Horehound, bitter herb, was made into candy for medicinal purposes. Your grandmother would make tea from horehound leaves, then cook that tea with sugar until hard crack stage, pour onto buttered sheets. Result was candy that tasted medicinal and bitter, but was believed to help with coughs and sore throats. Horehound candy represented understanding that candy could be medicinal, that bitterness could be valued, that food and medicine overlapped. It represented knowledge that some candies weren't just for pleasure, but for health. The process was simple, but required understanding of herb tea making and candy temperatures. Your grandmother had to make proper horehound tea. She had to cook it to right temperature. She had to know when to stop cooking, when commercial medicines replaced home remedies, and when taste preferences shifted toward pure sweetness, horehound candy disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding that candy could be intentionally bitter, not understanding purpose, not understanding that food and medicine were once more closely linked. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today, horehound candy almost extinct in America. Most people have never heard of it. They don't understand that candy could serve medicinal purposes, that bitterness was sometimes valuable, that food and medicine were once inseparable. The loss represents loss of understanding that cooking served multiple purposes. That same ingredient could be food and medicine simultaneously, that some tastes we now avoid were once valued. Modern candy making has become too focused on pleasure, too limited in purpose, too divorced from health and medicine. The knowledge that grandmother possessed, that understanding of medicinal herbs, of how to extract their properties, of how to preserve them in candy form, that knowledge is almost completely gone. Most modern Americans can't imagine candy serving any purpose except pleasure. Your grandmother would cook butter and brown sugar to hard crack stage, then drop spoonfuls onto waxed paper where they'd set into brittle, glossy pieces. Sometimes she'd add touch of vinegar to prevent crystallization. Flavor was intensely buttery, caramelized with slight bitterness, balancing sweetness. Butterscotch drops represented understanding of how brown sugar and butter worked together, how temperature affected texture, how right additions prevented unwanted crystallization. The process required judgment. Your grandmother had to know when mixture reached hard crack stage without thermometer. She had to judge exact moment to remove from heat, or candy would burn. She had to drop spoonfuls fast, before mixture cooled too much to drop properly. When candy became something bought, and when home candy making declined, butterscotch drops disappeared. Young people grew up not understanding critical temperatures, While praline candy was distinct dish, your grandmother might also make candied pecans by coating them in caramelized sugar mixture and letting them dry. Result was crispy outside, with pecan flavor shining through, less creamy than pralines, but more like coated nut. This represented different candy-making technique, coating rather than mixing, creating texture through coating. It showed understanding that same basic ingredients could be used differently depending on technique. Your grandmother understood coating technique. She knew how hot the sugar mixture should be. She knew how to coat pecans without having coating become too thick. She knew how long to let them dry before serving. When candy became something bought, and when nut varieties became standardized, candied pecans disappeared from homemaking. Young people grew up not understanding that you could make candied nuts at home, not understanding coating technique, not understanding how temperature affected final result. Knowledge largely disappeared. Today, candied pecans mainly produced commercially. When they appear in stores, they're expensive luxury items rather than homemade candy. The loss represents loss of understanding that different techniques created different results, that same ingredients could be used multiple ways, that mastery came through understanding how to use techniques. Modern candy making has become too limited in scope. We know candy means commercial product, pralines, chocolate-covered nuts, hard candies. We don't understand that same basic candy-making principles could be applied in different ways to create different products. The knowledge that grandmother possessed, that ability to coat nuts properly, that understanding of how temperature affected coating, that confidence in using different techniques, that knowledge is almost completely gone. Most people today would never think to make candied nuts from scratch. The possibility doesn't exist in their understanding of what's possible.